Joining us today is Khalil Gibran Muhammad, who is a professor of history, race, and public policy at Harvard Kennedy School. And he's also featured in the recent film, Racially Charged, America's Misdemeanor Problem. Professor Muhammad, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, Ben. Thank you.
Could you tell us a little bit about the film?
Yeah, the film is directed by Robert Greenwald. It is based off of a book, Punishment Without Crime, which is the first major treatment of the misdemeanor or petty crime system in America, written by my colleague, Alexandra Nadapoff. And she's at the Harvard Law School. It's really a book that takes the scale and scope of this system to task for the abuses of due process in every kind of way in which fairness and justice is not operating in the criminal system.
And, you know, as I was reading about the film and some of the things that are featured in the film, it's so reflective of how the prison system has been used over the years, particularly to target African Americans and almost from a labor perspective. Could you speak on that for us?
Yeah, so one of the things is, I mean, we are all creatures of our time. And so if we don't know our history or have a deep sense of it, it's easy to think that we're passing judgment on people who have just made bad decisions, and the system otherwise treats people who are worthy of the presumption of innocence and who follow the rules with the kind of justice they deserve. But it turns out that so much of our current system, which in its most pernicious ways is about generating revenue to satisfy the budgetary needs of courts and law enforcement communities, or basic general operating funds, like in a place like Ferguson, Missouri. And if we look at it in its present form and go back in time to the period after the end of slavery, when systems of convict labor and chain gangs emerged just after African Americans stepped into their freedom, we see almost in the most horrifying ways the exact same perverse incentives, where the basic idea was if you could coerce black people back to a plantation based on the threat of punishment, then you had about as good a post-slavery system of a neo-form of slavery as the one you just gotten rid of. And if they didn't want to cooperate, well, then you could charge them with crimes they didn't commit and lease them out to private contractors who were able to exploit their labor. So there's a lot to be said for how much our present looks a lot like the past.
Wow. And what's fascinating about that is that connection that you're talking about with the present and the past. And oftentimes I feel when we have these kind of conversations, especially in the political arena, it's almost as though opponents to this type of conversation from our position, or proponents for the prison system, the justice system as it is right now, they try to sever the cause from the effect. Right. We see the effect, which is over incarceration, private prison, the entire prison industrial complex. But there seems to be a concerted effort to disconnect and sever the reality of how this system was built. Could you speak to that ongoing process of severing the reality of where we are from exactly how we got here, and how that continues to continues the exploitation of human labor?
Yeah. Yes, it's a really good point. I think that political defenders, political elites, and other policymakers, and very vocal funders, wealthy people who basically shape our political system, those who defend the status quo, who believe that mostly our legal system is functioning just fine, and our police officers are not engaging in systemically discriminatory practices, but catching all the bad guys, and that everyone who goes to prison deserves to be there, are themselves actively denying the fact that it was only 50 years ago that during the height of the civil rights era, Southern sheriffs tried to lock up as many peacefully assembled nonviolent protesters as possible, as what happened in Albany, Georgia, or Birmingham, Alabama, just two of the most studied cases. So that's just the most obvious and the tip of the iceberg of the way that the criminal justice system has been used to crush dissent. Many people know, of course, that under Richard Nixon, the war on crime accelerated into the war on drugs. And John Ehrlichman described that system as really about crushing the black community and the anti-war left with the instrument of the criminal justice system. So the evidence is clear, but the political manipulation and the propaganda that somehow none of these things are connected is about as absurd as what we're seeing play out in Georgia with regard to Brian Kemp, the current Secretary of State, describing this not as Jim Crow, as if like, come on, how ridiculous is that? But that's exactly what it is. So
Right.
it is what it is.
Wow, and it's disconcerting. You mentioned Ferguson, and I'm to remind the viewers, like the report that came out that showed exactly how much of the city was funded based on the fines and penalties levied by not only the justice system there, the courts there, but also the policing agencies there. Could you speak about that a little bit more, but also in context of cash bail, how that has become a system in and of itself that not only keeps people in prison, but also funds this system?
Yeah, so what we know in the case of Ferguson, when the Department of Justice did a systems study to look at the context in which Darren Wilson killed Michael Brown, they found that from the law enforcement community to the court system, there was a clear understanding and, in fact, a directive that police officers would generate enough fines and fees to help to meet the budget goals of the city of Ferguson. And how they did that, however, was to literally make up and pick off people in their daily routines. One of the most horrendous of these cases was the case of a motorist named Mike, who was sitting watching his child play on a playground. And a police officer walks up to him, says, "Can I see your license and registration?" The guy hands him, before he hands it to him, he said, "What's your name?" He says, "Well, my name is Mike." And he hands him his license. It says Michael. And he says, "You lied to me." And that led to a series of fines. And those fines led to penalties for not paying the fines. And of course, for low income people, getting a $200 fine could be the difference between paying the rent or not paying the rent. So that's just a small slice of what that report found. But it was an unflinching examination of the systemic racism that the black residents of Ferguson face. Listen, cash bail is about as unconstitutional as anything else in a system designed for due process and equal protection. Because the bottom line is, if you're poor in this country and you cannot pay bail, you will go to jail. And when you go to jail, the stigma of the jail experience itself contributes to the likelihood of future conviction, whether you're innocent or not. If you're middle income or upper income, you are not going to go to jail, which works to your advantage. So the cash bail system should not exist. Money should not determine whether or not you are detained. Now, we could have a debate as to whether or not the seriousness of the crime itself should determine it, but the cash bail system has to go. It is what it is, and it's been that way for a long time because the system was designed to target low-income and poor people above all else.
I wish we had a lot more time to explore this, because just yesterday, Senator Tom Cotton tweeted out that America has an under-incarceration problem. Clearly absurd on the surface of it when you consider the statistics. And then we have in St. Louis, where there was the jail protest, where people who have been in jail, one individual was there for 5 years because they could not get a court date. They're not all directly tied to the cash system, but it does speaks to the problems that we have in general, politically, as well as in the criminal justice system. Could you help us to understand what we can do to push back against these things when the rhetoric and the propaganda is to the point where a sitting senator can absolutely just lie to the entire country and say our problem here is under incarceration?
Well, this is probably the toughest part of this conversation we're going to have. So let me just say something about Tom Cotton. He is right about underenforcement. The underenforcement that should have meant that much of the current political class would have been subject to more legal scrutiny coming out of the last administration. And we know, of course, that the malfeasance of a lot of Wall Street actors that gave us the Great Recession was also underenforced or underincarcerated. But it's also true that the people who have been responsible for a lot of the surveillance and criminalization of low-income people of color are also people like Michael Bloomberg, the former moderate to liberal mayor of New York City, and of course, Joe Biden himself, our current president. So when you ask the question, what should we be doing about this? Part of this is that this is not just a Tom Cotton problem or a white nationalist problem or a right-winger problem. This is a problem about the punitive culture of America that has been thinking for a long time that punishment is the blunt instrument of social control. And it works, of course, if the point is to exploit people, but it doesn't work if you actually have a country that believes in individual dignity and constitutional rights. And we're just simply not there yet. So we're going to have to do massive re-education of the entire public if we're going to get to a future where we actually believe in justice.
I absolutely love the way you frame that. The under incarceration of former politicians and administrations and Wall Street, for that matter. Professor Muhammad, professor of history, race, and public policy at Harvard Kennedy School. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.